Time. Now I'd wonderfully like us all to greet John Flaherty back here for another segment. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Linda. Excellent. So here we go again. Fantastic. Do you think I have anything left to share with you? I wonder. We'll see what happens. Christine asked me, would I speak a little more slowly for those who are not English or not having necessarily the best command of English, just to make sure you don't miss anything. So I will do my best to do as I've been requested to do. And I suppose the only reason maybe I wasn't doing that yesterday was because there's so much to get through. It's kind of huge amounts. And I could start anywhere and not quite know when to stop. But I promise you I will. And to the best of my ability, I'll go at the pace that most of you can keep up with. But I won't make that a promise. I've mentioned the book. The reason I mentioned this book again is because the message of the book is quite unique. I know that. I also know the power of the message of the book has got nothing at all to do with John Flaherty. So much so that when I read the book myself, I realize that this John Flaherty, if he'd been in the head of John Flaherty, could never have written such a thing, even if he tried. And I think, to be honest, that's what Gunther and Wolfing were actually reminding us of earlier today, that we can so very easily miss the so much more about ourselves and about life if we're not careful, because there's so much more about ourselves and about life. So much more that we're only just beginning to discover. But when you actually open yourself to the many, many possibilities, slow enough, Christine? Okay. The many, many possibilities that exist, truly amazing things begin to happen. We could call them the miraculous. And the miraculous, when we're becoming more consciously aware, and when we're meeting another person, and realizing that there couldn't possibly be any separation between ourselves and the so-called other, transformation begins to happen. Now, I've called this book, the message of this book, Addiction Unplugged, How to Be Free. I'm also well aware of the fact that although many of you sitting here won't necessarily have had any reason to believe yourself to have had any form of addiction to alcohol or to substance uses or to any other possible thing or experience or behavior, I still want to actually today spend a little bit of time on addiction for the very many of you who have had, for the very many of you who know of others who have had, and for the people who are on webcast who definitely will have had. But at the same time, so that you're not just sitting through a thing that's got nothing whatsoever to do with you, which is highly unlikely, given that we couldn't possibly be separate from another, then I want you, to the best of your ability, to see that the message of what I share with you today has every relevance to yourself as well as to anybody who recognizes that they have been in what's sometimes called addiction. The difference between this book and most other tried and tested means of treating addiction is that this, to my knowledge, is the first book of its kind to be written from the perspective of conscious awareness. And as you know, just like our two speakers this morning have been reminding us, that changes everything. Everything. You see, ignorance is a very necessary ingredient for keeping a victim consciousness or a victim mentality firmly in place. And you know from your experience, just like I know from my experience, that this planet is pitted with a victim consciousness and has, largely speaking, still insisted that we need to be kept in ignorance. However, the light body, which we now know we are, is urging us to see the more of that which we might otherwise completely miss. And that would be the greatest sin that one could ever possibly be culpable of. And I use that word sin very deliberately, because the literal translation of that is to miss. To so completely miss the everything that we get stuck on one track way of seeing, experiencing whatever's left, basically, whatever's left. Usually a very, very small amount of what otherwise could possibly be in our more conscious experience. It's unlikely now that that's going to happen anymore to you. And if I've had any part to play in that, you can blame me for it, but I'm actually very delighted and privileged to have played a part in it. You see, I know that as you become more consciously aware, it's a bit like opening a Pandora's box. You've no idea what's going to happen next, but you certainly do know that there's no way that you can return to anything of the smallness that you once thought you actually were. Could I put it another way? Does a fish know that there's any such thing as water? How would we know? We're not a fish. But in all likelihood, it probably doesn't. But it certainly knows the absence of it. You know, take a fish out of water and look at the state of the poor thing. Now that you know that you are the light body, always have been, always will be, are you likely to continue remembering that? Or will you simply know the absence of it when you've forgotten to remember it, which will happen periodically until it doesn't? Does the person in addiction know the natural joy that they've so much been desiring as their completeness, the fullness, the living their own truth of, but hasn't yet been able to make their own? Or do they just simply know from their experience the absence of it? And is that not really all that they're striving so much more to have again in their experience? So how does all of this come about? You know, people say to me, well, you know, John, people in addiction, you know, what are they doing to themselves? That, you know, how can they not think that this is such a bad choice to be making? And surely it's up to themselves to do something about it. And don't we just need to be exercising tough love here? I assure you, there is no such thing as tough love. There's either love or it's not love. Of all the people that I have worked with over the years in addiction, And it is a very, very rewarding thing for myself to have been able to be in that position, because there's such a lot that I can discover more about myself as I do so. The person in addiction, I mean really, really deeply in pain of their addiction, and have always been in pain long before they started to excess in whichever way they've chosen to do that, rather than the person who just drinks or uses recreationally or excessively. I don't really mean that individual, but the person in deep, deep pain as a result of their addictive behavior. In every instance, bar none, that person has been violated, abused, sometimes sexually, sometimes physically, often mentally, definitely emotionally, at a very early stage in their life. Always, bar none. It's a very difficult thing sometimes for that individual to recognize that about themselves, because we're very used to denying it, not thinking it could possibly be that which we've experienced. But it's always there, always evident. And so our current mainstream ways of treating addictions couldn't possibly be further away from how to actually bring about a resolve, a healing, a closure, a completeness in the life of the person in addiction, because it's all concentrated on head rather than heart. It's a very logical approach to an incredibly illogical behavior. You see, addictions don't make logic sense, do they? You know, why would a person persist in abusing their own bodies when they know it causes them deep suffering, only to keep returning to it all of the time? It does not make logic sense. And that's because it stems from a much, much earlier time in their life. It stems from what sometimes is referred to as the imprint years. We usually tend to think of the imprint years between 0 and about 6 or 7 years old. And before the age of 6 or 7, a child simply does not possess the reasoning, rationalize, logic way of making sense of life. That develops, but it certainly doesn't develop before that age of about 6 or 7 years old. Prior to that age, each of us is simply taking in information, data, not making sense of it, but feeling it. Feeling it. Borrowed attitudes, borrowed circumstances, borrowed interpretations, and generally speaking, holding it as if it were a truth about ourselves, a judgment about ourselves. Where others are not judging, we quickly, in that very short span of time, take up from where others have left off, and we start to judge ourselves. So when a person goes along years later to do something about their addiction recovery, we do the most criminal thing of all. We put them through processes that are all logic and that, usually speaking, further add to the suffering of that individual by insisting that they try to make still logic sense of something that's totally illogical, even though they're in an adult body. So we have to get better at understanding the other. We have to be able to speak to the childlike part of the adult who suffered such violation at an early stage in their life. We've got to get much better than we have been at that. And of course we can. I asked you just yesterday, I'll ask it again, just to make sure that you don't forget to remember. Do you know that you are infinitely greater than your thoughts would otherwise have you think you are? Yes. Okay, do you know that you're infinitely greater than your behaviors that you've been behaving would otherwise keep you behaving? Yes. Do you believe? Exactly. Do you believe? Why would you do that? Why would you think it necessary to believe? Believe in anything. Is a belief very important? Has a belief ever served you very well? What's a belief, for goodness sake? When each of us come into the world, when we were all popped out from the womb, we don't come into this world with a bottle of beer in our hand, right? We just don't. Somewhere along the line, that behavior has had to be learned. And it doesn't take rocket science to understand why a person would use alcohol or substances or whatever escapism that they can possibly muster if it is just to quell, calm, make peace with the deep suffering that's never made logical sense to them, in order just to be a human being, rather than, as we often have them try to be, a human doing. There's a big difference. But because that individual has learned from the outset to try making life work from a victim mentality, they do try desperately hard, harder than perhaps you can even imagine, to still try making logical sense to a very illogically formed experience in their life. Now that you are aware of your light body, now that you know you're so much greater than your thoughts, your beliefs, your behaviors would otherwise have you keep thinking, behaving, or believing that you are, you'll be able to look at the whole field of addiction in an entirely different way. And I trust that you will. You'll also be able to look at your own addictive behaviors and make changes accordingly in whatever they are, because you will have them. As I mentioned to you yesterday, the greatest addiction we each of us have is to our thoughts about things. The biggest one of all is the need to be right about something. It's a judgment. I'll give you another word for the word belief. Judgment. That's what a belief is. It's a judgment. A belief. Why would you need to have a judgment between you and the source of life that's sourcing you? Why would you need to have a belief, judgment, that could make you feel for a second at all separate from any other being on this planet? Only a judgment can do that. And the funny thing about a judgment or a belief is most of the time we don't know that we're in it. We really don't know that we're judging. We really don't know what we're believing. I've talked a little bit about my background as a Catholic priest. So if a person says that they're no longer believing in a Catholic faith, very interesting to see that person convincing themselves that they actually don't still carry that belief. And everything about their behavior tells you that they're absolutely entrenched in it still. Because we continue to carry the traits of that which we first learned when we were very young. when we were in those imprint years. Think of the word imprint. It's a very deep impression made upon us, usually not deliberately so, you know. I came into this world, and before I knew it, I was going to be named John. Right? All right, take a little look at my parents. Okay, I'll give it a go. This one says she's my mother. I was inside her for the last 9 months. Seemed all right in there. I certainly didn't seem disconnected from the source of life that was sourcing me. It was quite cozy, pleasant enough. Didn't even have to think about eating. It all just happened. Now I'm having to discover that they say, welcome to my family. I look to see, oh, where's my father? Well, my father was there. Many of you maybe look to see, oh, father maybe wasn't there. Okay, so certainly, right from the beginning, you get the belief, or you make the judgment that, you know, somebody's present, somebody isn't in your life. Somebody's interested in you, somebody isn't interested in you. So I was named John. You know, you don't even get to choose that about yourself. But I went along with John. After all, my father was John. His father was John before him, you know. Not that imaginative, but, you know, okay. I can answer to John. John's okay with me. And then before you know it, well, in my particular family, you know, it was a soccer team, followed the red and white stripes of Sunderland. And before I knew it, I was wearing that shirt too. I was our Sunderland supporter. The greatest team the world has ever seen. Or so I was told. I've yet to actually see it. But I believe it. Because that's what a belief is like. We don't usually notice it. We certainly don't question it. And before we know it, we're behaving it. And it's a thought that keeps it in place. Some beliefs apparently serve us well. Some are incredibly detrimental to us. But because they're very subtle, we rarely stop to notice them until we do. This weekend, you've taken deliberate time out to spot some of your own beliefs. I hope you have. Judgments. I hope you have. That have become your behaviors, that in turn have become your thoughts, that in turn have become your life experiences. And you've given yourself time to wonder, is that the light body? Or, like the fish, is it just an experience of the absence of it? If you haven't yet considered that, maybe you will before the end of the weekend. Have you simply been existing in the absence of that which you know you truly are? Or are you now aware of who you truly are? Because there's a major difference. In addiction, a person has got so very used to just accepting, generally speaking, the smallness of that they were made to feel, the lack of belonging that they desperately want to have and haven't been able to ever make their own experience. And they search for it, and they try so hard for it. That's why I love to work with the individual going through that process, because it's honestly become my own observation that that individual, if anything, is usually so much more advanced than most of us, for the very reason that they know there's so much more than their life experience has made them think or believe themselves to be. In your search, maybe the time has come just to drop the search. Know it's all over. Breathe a sigh of relief. Know that your addictions have now become something else. Maybe they've moved to a preference about yourself. That's an awesome discovery for any individual I've ever worked with who once thought they were their addictions only, to discover that they can make a preference about themselves and about life. Wow. I've heard that sound many a time from an individual who said, I didn't know I could do that. Have a preference about, do you mean I can go? I suppose I can. You know, it's that kind of discovery. That's an amazing freedom to the person who at one time thought that that was not going to ever be a possibility for them to make real. You can do the same. I want you to really think carefully about what addictive, and by addictive behavior, I really mean what stuck place that you ever simply got into the way of and then stopped off at, thinking that that was your lot, thinking that there couldn't possibly be anything more to you than just that experience. And then you can make your own preference. And so you can begin the movement, if you will, from addictions to a place of preference. And then when you realize that you can have a preference about something, you can do the next great thing for yourself. You can move from a place of preference to a newfound acceptance about the truth, the light body truth of who you really are. That's why I've called this book an addiction discovery book. Nothing to do with recovery at all. And that's good news for the person who's been desperately trying to make that logical recovery process work in an illogical, childlike being that still hasn't had the opportunity to see through their child and into adult body because they were stopped at an early stage from having that natural progression. Haven't yet discovered what it's like to feel the natural joy that they've had to, for whatever belief, put on hold about themselves. I've been to lots of different parts of the world, and I've worked with lots of different people in addiction. And on each occasion I've asked them 3 questions. And I want you to consider the very same questions. Why would you not? The first would be, what are you in recovery from? Do you know, I've heard people saying, I've been in recovery for 20 years, been in recovery for 30 years, I've been in recovery for 50 years. I've got my chip, I've got my cake, I've got all the things that go with it, apparently. What are you in recovery from? And you know what? There's usually been a very blank response. The individual has got so used to using that term about themselves, that belief, that judgment about themselves, they've actually forgotten what it was that they were in recovery from. So they're in recovery. They're in recovery. From what? Okay, I don't know. Never thought of that. Really, that's the response. And maybe neither have you. Until today. Next question would be, well, how long are you going to be in recovery? Oh, wow. That's a hard question, you know. Well, as long as it takes. As long as it takes to be in recovery from something you don't know what you're in recovery from. Oh, come on, guys, you know. Third question, the inevitable question. Well, how will you know when you're ever recovered? How will you know? We do such stupid things, such judgmental things, such useless things to ourselves, and worse still, to another. And we actually call it treatment. We actually call it health care. That's sick care. That's a violation. That's a very unconscious behavior. That really just is unacceptable behavior, which comes from a thought, which has a belief behind the thought, which became the behavior, which became the action. I was just talking to Linda there before, and it occurred to me, of course, that, and you've heard me mention him a few times this last couple of days, Albert Einstein, I think, is the man credited for this particular statement, and he says, the all-important question for every one of us to ask is, do you believe in an all-loving, all-providing universe, or do you believe in a punishing universe, or one of lack? The answer to which colors everything else. Now, in those imprint years, no matter how good our parents were, I happen to, and I'm going to use a nice little English term for you, I happen to believe that I had the best parents since sliced bread. They were lovely. Right? It was my mum and my dad. But although they assumed the role of the source of life that sourced me, they weren't. They weren't. And your parents really didn't source you. The source of life that sources you gave birth to you through your parents. That's a big difference. Don't forget to remember it. Because whether you had the best parents in the world, or whether you are the best parents in the world, you're not really going to come up to the same standard as the source of life that sources everything. But when we do come into the world, we give such authority immediately over to those parents. They are God. And depending what they do, depending what they believe, depending on what they behave, depending on what the life situations are that they actually introduce you to, is the imprint that you continue to behave, think, and believe for the rest of your days, until you don't. And that can have good effects, and it can have disastrous effects. And there's no point in blaming or judging your parents. It's just, as we've been saying, how it is, until it isn't. So we go through life and we make this kind of very piecemeal, wholehearted try at making sense of it. It's also why I've described the book as a common sense discovery book. Only trouble with common sense? Not very common. It's not very common until it is. Ask yourselves those three little questions. What have you been spending so long in this lifetime over, or indeed any past lifetimes, if you want to go into them, that you thought you were in recovery from, that seemed to take you such a long time to ever get over, before you could ever give yourself, small s, back to yourself, capital S, the truth of who you really are. Has it taken a long time? Maybe too long? Was it painful that, like we looked at yesterday, suddenly became suffering? Or is it just time now to not sin, not miss the obvious for another second longer? That's what the light body is inviting you to actually embrace, live out, step into, whatever terminology best suits you, allow, without judgment, you to be and you to experience. Because as soon as you do, you will know the difference that makes to everything. 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 Life will never be the same again. You can blame me for it if you want. I'm absolutely delighted to actually have had the honor of actually opening up the Pandora's box for you. For you. Because that's just the way it is. And the better it gets, the better it gets. Now, all those people that I've had the privilege, deep privilege, of working with in their addictions, I tell you what, whether they were fidgety on a chair or whether they had to have a bottle of beer in their hand or whatever the heck it was that they thought was so necessary to be doing to themselves, they would have been able to sit through Wolfing and Gunther's talks this morning and they would have loved it. Loved it. They wouldn't need to be convinced of any of it because they're already there. They're already there. That's why they seem so awkward to be in our lives. And I suppose I'm getting a little emotional as I think about that, because, of course, if I have the privilege of sitting with another person desperately wanting to change their experience about themselves, go free, give themselves back to themselves, be the truth of who they are, then of course it profoundly affects me, because there is no separation between me and another. And in fact, it was just this very weekend that Ryan, a beautiful soul, had decided that he had to leave this world because the pain of his addiction was just too much to bear. And in fact, if you read my book, you'll see Ryan's very beautiful story in there, and you'll soon see why Ryan just knew that that was just time to go back to the source of life that sourced him. You see, Ryan had found that place of completion about himself, and he knew he didn't need to prolong the heavy, burdensome process of remaining in recovery any longer. So he was able to give himself back to himself. And he took his own life, which of course many of our beliefs would tell us in judgment were an awful thing to do. But I can assure you that one of the most important things for Ryan to have discovered before he went back to the source of life that sources us all was the most important thing that Ryan could have ever heard. And it was one that changed his life entirely. He didn't remain in his addictive behaviors once he knew that you can be happy, Ryan, or you can be very happy. I distinctly remember the day I actually shared that with him as a possibility, as a preference. And Ryan's experiencing very, very happy. Very happy. And you can too. But the beauty about what Ryan has shown us all is that we don't actually have to wait until we physically die before we physically move from this world to the next. We can actually begin to die before we die. The Sufis in the Muslim faith have that wonderful expression of things. We can begin to die, in other words, to our beliefs about things. We can begin to die to our thoughts about things. What a relief that would be, eh? We can begin to die to our behaviors that we've been behaving. We can begin to die to the life situations and experiences that we thought it was necessary to keep in our experience, long before it's time to physically die. And that is the light body, where we go free in the here and in the now. In the now. You see, in truth, there's never anything bad happening to us. Ryan knows that. People say, life's shit. Life's so hard. Life's this, life's that. There was a guy in Canada, in Vancouver, and he used to say to me, John, life's got a nasty habit of biting me in the arse. Well, I had a little look behind him. There was no sign of it. I asked him, had you ever actually seen life biting you in the arse? He said, oh, you know what I mean. I said, actually, I don't. I really don't. You see, life is just lifing us. Life's not doing anything bad to us. It's not doing anything particularly good to us. It's just lifing us. What we do with it is another matter altogether. Another matter altogether. And you, who now have opened the Pandora's box, and know that you are now, whether you like it or not, because there's no going back, are now more consciously aware, know that to be a truth. You just know it. Your heart's always known it. Now your mind's actually, rather reluctantly, beginning to catch up. There is only the now. And it's almost time for me to complete my little session with you. But before I do that, I want you to make sure that you know there's only the now. Okay, here we go. Let's just capture any moment at all. We'll just get this one. All right. Hold it. Oh, no. Try again. Hang on. This one. There's a now moment. Right. Tell me if I'm right or telling me if I'm wrong. But is there anything happening in it? I'll use another expression. There's bugger all happening in it, right? There's nothing happening. Correct me if I'm wrong. We'll give it one more go. Yeah, that one. Nothing. Not a thing. Other than what we choose to put in it. That's it. You who are now more consciously aware now know that to be a truth. So, decide. Don't forget to remember the truth of who you are. And from that truth, decide what it is that you choose to fill the now with. You cannot not create. Decide what it is that you're creating and then create it. You cannot be separate from the source of life that's sourcing you. Know that. So there's no possibility that you can possibly make a right or indeed a wrong decision. I am that I am. You bet you are. So think twice if ever you're tempted to say, my name is John, and I am an alcoholic, or I am an addict, because that's got to be the greatest lie you could ever make about the truth of who you really are. That's not who you are, but it is who you think you are. Or it is who you've believed other people to believe you are. But it's not who you truly are. I am that I am simply recognizes that I exist. You're just being lifed, in other words. Anything else that you put in it, in any given now moment, could only possibly be a judgment, a belief that would tell you otherwise. And so, the meaning of life is indeed the meaning that you give to it. I suggest you select a really good one and make it a really complete experience for yourself, whatever your own experience of life has been to date. If you didn't have the greatest of the imprint years, and you are carrying the scars of that, now is the time, nonetheless, to remove judgment of another, and particularly judgment of your own, about that experience, and discover who you really are, and make your further choices only from that place of empowerment. Recap. Discover who you're very definitely not, the understanding of which will change everything. Uncover, like the dog looking for its bone, the truth of who you really are. You know you left it somewhere. The experience of which will change everything. Third level of conscious awareness. Empower yourself, small s, by yourself, capital S, the source of life that's sourcing you. That's not how powerless you are, that's how very powerful you are. Namaste. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks to John Flaherty. Thank you. Thank you.